record. When we start with the media in America, we must start with the press, because there were no advanced social media technology or forms of communication. No television or radio, no iPhones, cell phones, Androids, whatever we got, Blackberries, Kindles, Fires, pads, notebooks, tablets, smartwatches, whatever. There was just the press that printed newspapers, because there was no TV, there was no news stations. And from the very beginning, each party that we began with had their own press, their partisan press. For the Federalists, the big newspaper was the Gazette of the United States. And for the Anti-Federalists, the National Gazette. So the Gazette of the United States would have written articles about banking, about manufacturing, about urban growth, whereas the National Gazette would have focused on farmers, rural communities, intellectuals. So we've always had a partisan press. Today, some people would say, CNN and Fox and MSNBC, they're not partisan, they're neutral. And most people would say, no, Fox is partisan because they lean towards Republicans. CNN and MSNBC are partisan because they lean towards Democrats. People would say the only partisan news producers today, as far as terms of television, would be the big three from the 60s and 70s, ABC, NBC, and CBS. But even those lean more towards the left, in my opinion, towards Democrats. Maybe the most neutral news source you can read today or listen to is NPR radio, National Public Radio. So if you want to be a good, informed, objective citizen, I would advise that if you do like a certain station or certain newscasters, and they line up more with your viewpoints, that's well, but you might want to listen to something that maybe will give a more unbiased view, like NPR. Or maybe from time to time listen to the other side to see how they are looking at things. All righty, these page numbers here are not correct. I've got to update my page numbers. But there are three functions of the media's communication. The media is a source for information. This is how citizens become aware of what is happening in government. And we know today, because we live in a global world, that we are informed about all things that are going on in our country, in our state, and in our world. Politics, military, wars, culture, sports, entertainment. We are informed about everything through media. But in terms of government and politics, the media really is our primary way of being aware of who's running, their viewpoints, what are the issues. Another function of the media's communication is to provide a platform in which the public can discuss things, a forum. As a lot of times you'll see the news, a news broadcast, and you'll see a reporter going and talking to people in their towns. We're having a town meeting and letting people discuss their opinions about issues and about candidates. Concerning the print media, citizens in America can write letters to the editor to be printed in the newspaper, sharing your opinion. And then the third function of the media is to be a watchdog. This is similar to what we learned in chapter 15 with the court system, that anybody who works for a federal agency and they're aware of wrongdoing, they can tell the authorities and they're a whistleblower. Well, the media, their main role is really to be a monitor or a watchdog and to report wrongdoing by our public officials. In classical liberalism, and when we talk about classical liberalism, we're talking about kind of the classical thinking that our country was founded upon, the Enlightenment thinking, rationalism. When it comes to a democracy, the primary role of the media is to keep an eye on the government, right? Because our country was set up where the people are the authority, and those who are the government, we choose them and we give them the right to represent us, but they have to answer to us. But we as citizens, we have to live our normal lives. We have to go to work. We have to go to the store. We have to go to our kids' games, our kids' activities. We have church and organizations, and we have life. And we don't live in Washington, D.C. We don't live in Oklahoma City. We can't always see what our leaders are doing. So that's what the media is to do. And if they are aware of some government official abusing their authority, they need to reveal that. That's why the media must be independent from the government. Think about the journalists in China. China controls their media. So journalists are not free to report wrongdoings and abuses. If they do, most likely they're going to disappear forever. They've got to report what the government, the propaganda that the government feeds them. Any questions on those three main functions of the media? I can sing the old song. The feeling you get from a Coca-Cola Classic. All righty, that's for you. All right, so journalists, here's an example of maybe the most famous example of watchdog journalism. But before we proceed, someone remind us, Dr. Pepper. You're a pepper, she's a pepper, you can be a pepper too. That's an old Dr. Pepper commercial. Okay. Before we proceed, someone remind us who the only president to ever resign was. I am not a crook.
Was it Nixon or?
Bingo, ding, 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 ding. Richard Nixon. So why did Tricky Dick, that was his nickname, why did Tricky Dick have to resign? Because
impeached?
He was, but why was that going to happen? That's I'm asking that rhetorically. That leads me to these two men. These two men, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, journalists for the Washington Post, started publishing articles in the early 1970s about a break-in at the Democratic national offices in Washington, D.C. Several men broke in trying to get documents. These men started investigating and writing articles. And after several months to a year, they blew the lid open on Watergate. Nixon's top men in his cabinet had hired these men to break in to the Democratic national offices and try to get information. Eventually, it was proven that it went all the way to Nixon, and that's why he eventually had to resign. But these men were acting as watchdogs. And even today, Bob Woodward, anybody here a news junkie? You watch the news? Well, Bob Woodward was on this morning. He still is writing books. He wrote 3 books about Trump, and he just released 8 hours of interviews with Trump because he felt like Trump is such a threat. And so he's still working as a watchdog. They wrote a book, All the President's Men. And so that is probably the most outstanding example of watchdog journalism in our nation, certainly for the last 50 years. Alrighty, so there's several types of media. We've been talking about the print media, newspapers. And then we saw that journalists can write books. Broadcast media began with the big 3 of NBC, ABC, CBS, and now you've got a plethora, that's a great word, a plethora of broadcast media stations. Now, when we talk about media, and we're including film and television and video games, we're talking about a medium, something by which information comes to us through. But even today, Hollywood and even video games are becoming political. It seems like every movie now that comes out has to have a LGBTQZPT 0 MNS character. You know, that's not all the letters, I know it, but I'm just saying that for emphasis. Every movie, every show has to have that kind of character. Do you think that's not political? That's political. Almost every other commercial now shows a couple kissing. So of the same gender. So that is trying to be political and push that view, that worldview upon the public, because that wasn't a popular worldview going back just 30 years ago. Yeah, and I think even in video games, I'll have to ask my son, since he's a gamer. Any of you a gamer? If you are, you should consider coming to Carl Albert. We've got a esports team here at Carl Albert. But you two really are gamers? What's the game where you play like soccer with cars?
Rocket League.
You play that?
No.
No and yes. Trying to think of what my son plays. Of course, he plays like all the Call of Duty and special ops games.
Does he play Fortnite?
You can't stand it. Because all these little kids like 5 years ago were always doing the Fortnite dance. Which that was probably you too. Because 5, 8 years ago, you guys have been little kids, right? Okay. Look how the media has transformed from the big three to the many hundreds. Now, our chapter will mention that the media, even though it looks like there's a lot, really, most of the media is owned by private companies that own several. For example, looking here at Disney. Disney owns ABC, ESPN, Pixar, Miramax, and Marvel Studios. CBS owns Showtime, NFL.com, 60 Minutes, Jeopardy, and the Smithsonian Channel. Time Warner owns CNN, HBO, Time. So while there are a lot of channels and options to watch, most of these are controlled by a few, as our textbook mentions, media monopolies. And most of them, well, I think we could say all of them are in it for what? Show me the
world.
Show me the
Money.
money. Those big corporations are in it first and foremost for the money. Okay, Joe plays Smash Brothers and Rocket League. His Smash Brothers team is tied for #1 in the state. That is impressive. Nicole says old news to everyone. Well, the Mojo students, and I didn't know that. So did you see what I put? Y'all heard of Pac-Man? I am awesome. as they used to say in the early 2000s, I'm the bomb. All right. So in 1983, let's look at a 30-year difference. Bomb.com now, okay. It's good to know. So in 1983, there were 50 companies that owned 90% of the US media. And then in 2012, only 6 media giants owned 90% of the media. So it really consolidated, and those are giants that own that are making a lot of money. And today, what could we add today to this? Thinking of Elon Musk. We could add Twitter.
I was gonna say Facebook.
Twitter, I think that's Zuckerberg.
True.
Alrighty, how the media influences us simple folk. How does the media spoon feed us? Well, one thing they do is they set the agenda. In other words, when you turn on the news at night or the mornings, they've already set the agenda of what you're going to see. This is them being a gatekeeper. Nothing gets through the gates unless they allow it. Two other ways that they influence us is with framing and priming. So when it comes to framing, think of a picture frame. Think of a picture frame. So right now in the frame that you can see me in, you can see a wall with a little wall hanging, and you can see a lattice behind me with some flowers, which is not mine. You can see a window with a curtain, which I wouldn't have a curtain, I would have a shade. You see a picture up there. But if I was to change the frame, you would see a bookshelf and diplomas and another window. So what you're seeing is the frame that I'm presenting to you. So think of that when you think about how the news, when they show something, whether it's the visual or whether it's the details that they tell you, they're framing it so that you'll see it in a certain way. So let me show you an example. So here is something you might see on a news show. When actually, when they filmed it, this was how it really looked. Here's another example. Let's say you guys have heard of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacy group from the Civil War era. There's still, I think there's still, I don't know if there's actual chapters still around, but there are people who might say they are KKK. Let's say a KKK group's plans to go to Oklahoma City for a rally. Let's say you watch Channel 4 in Oklahoma City. Channel 4 is NBC. The way they frame the story is they say that they do a story on the rally suggesting that the KKK rally may attract protesters, which might result in violence. And they interview the police sergeant about how they had to have extra security and prevent injuries. So the reporter has framed the story as a public safety issue. But let's say the folks in Muldrow watch Channel 5, which is ABC, and the reporter there does a story on the rally focusing on the KKK's right to assemble and have free speech. And they bring in a law professor from University of Oklahoma who talks about the First Amendment right for the KKK to assemble and have free speech. So Channel 5 framed the story as a freedom of speech issue. Okay, that makes sense. One frame was public safety, one frame was free speech. Now, sometimes we said it can be a visual framing. So here's an example. A couple of years ago, this man shot this young man, and this young man died. Now, notice how one station framed it. This young man kind of has an unpleasant, almost scowl look. Here he's got a nice, pleasant smile. Here he is a little bit more darkish brown. And he is clearly African American. But actually he's not that dark brown, sorry. Almost like Caucasian. Another station might show these two pictures. Now he's smiling. More of a goatee-ish, little bit darker, maybe looks more Hispanic. And he is African American still, more with a scowl, but a little bit darker. The truth is that this man was a Hispanic American. He did shoot this young man. He shot him. He was a member of his neighborhood watch. He saw him prowling around the neighborhood, or he thought he was prowling, and confronted him, and the young man, he felt like, attacked him, and he shot him. So at first it was framed as a white man shooting a black man unarmed out of racism. Other outlets, other news media outlets framed it that no, he was a Hispanic man on a neighborhood watch. He's smiling, he's got a tie on, he's a good citizen, he's watching over his neighborhood. And this young man was in the neighborhood, prowling around, doing shenanigans. Here he looks like he's 13. Here he looks closer to his age. I think he was 16 or 17. So that's an example of framing. It happened with O.J. Simpson. Newsweek had a more accurate depiction of him. Time kind of made him look darker. Newsweek framed it trail of blood, which could lead to the example or the opinion that, oh yeah, there's a trail of blood to OJ. Here, an American tragedy. African-American man being framed and put in jail. So that's framing. Very quickly, priming is, have you ever heard the saying, you have to prime the pump? Well, you know, they used to get water from a well, right? Where they had to pump the water well, right? You seen that? And the water well had a washer on it, had a rubber washer. And if you didn't use it for a while, you had to pour water on the washer to make it wet. And there would be air in the line, so you had to prime the pump. You had to pump the air out. So priming is really just repetition. So when it comes to media, when they prime a story, that means they're going to repeatedly show you the same story or the same details.
Mr. Binks,
Yep,
it's 11:45.
thank you. So right now, most media is priming. Can anybody guess? They've been priming something for a year and a half now, almost a year and 8 months, most media. Almost every day, you hear about the January 6th insurrection. That's priming. Now, some stations will only tell you certain details about it. That's what priming is. Very quickly, in the early 1900s, a phenomena came out called yellow journalism. This is when journalists would exaggerate their news stories so they could get more readers. Yellow journalism. Another thing that's happened with a lot of news outlets is they have become advocates for certain viewpoints or certain policies or interests. So theoretically, journalists should be neutral. They shouldn't have any bias. They should try to be objective. But a lot of them have become advocates for their political views. All right, I'm going to let you look over the slides in the chapter when you do your worksheet about how the media is regulated. Do you have any questions for me? Oh, I'm sorry, you guys, you groups, why didn't you tell me? 11:30. All right, so you guys are going to get to all do it on Monday. So hope that didn't hurt your feelings. All right, put that Dr. Pepper down and go get you a Coke. And we'll see you on Friday.